there's people on the internet who don't like us. Do you consider them enemies?
Yes.
You do?
No, I'm just kidding.
What's up, you guys? And welcome back to school. But don't worry, everything is cool. I'm your host, Julyssa. And of course, I am here with the boys, Steve and Brandon. Say what's up, you guys.
What's up?
And we have a special guest today. We have Mirella Guzman.
Woo!
Welcome.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for
Thank
coming.
you for having me.
We're so excited to have you.
Yeah.
I know.
And get to know you.
Yeah, so for the folks at home, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Okay. In this camera?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whatever
Cool.
you can
Oh
look
my
at us.
God.
You can look at us too.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
you don't have
Okay.
to look at the camera.
Yeah.
I am a student, really. I go to Sac State.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still an undergrad. Technically, I'll be graduating in the summer. I mean, I work, but my work doesn't really have anything to do with my school. So I guess I'll talk more about school, like the work that I do through, like as a student. I'm a student researcher. So I research mainly focusing on like Chicanx and Latinx communities. I also intern at Nopal, which is a like political and educational project based in Stockton. And yeah, I'm essentially a student.
Really, that's really cool. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when we first met, I think that was what really intrigued me about having you on and talking to you on the podcast was your studies on and researching Chicanx and Latinx studies. I mean, for me, I've never really heard about that in a academic like setting. I mostly hear about it through like I don't know conversations that people have,
Like social stuff.
yeah, social stuff.
Yeah.
I've never really heard like an actual a take from like research. And then when me and you talked off the podcast, I was like, wow, I didn't know that there was such a huge field of work in this subject matter. So I guess I wanted to start off with like what really interests you or originally interested you in studying that field. Yeah.
So same, that I had no idea that this was like a field of study until about, I think like a year and a half ago.
Oh.
So I had no idea what ethnic studies was. I did undergrad for 6 years. So after I graduate this summer, it'll be like officially 6 years that I've been in undergrad. And usually most people finish in 4.
Yeah.
But that's because I changed my major so many times.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was like 7 times that I changed it.
Yeah.
So it was
Really?
crazy. Yeah. I changed it 7 times. Like the first few had really nothing, I guess not nothing to do with ethnic studies, but I went to anthropology, psychology. I wanted to be a history major. I was a Spanish major. I was an ASL major. I went back to psychology. It was everywhere. But I think after I got out of high school, I really started to think about identity. But like I said, I had no idea essentially like what that meant or that I could even do anything like in education with that. So by the time I had gone into college, I like junior college, my second year, I think, or maybe second semester, I'm not sure, I took a Chicano history class. And I thought it was super interesting. And I was like, that's what I want to do, but I don't want to be a history major because then I have to take like all of the histories and I don't want to do that. So I just brushed it off. I didn't think anything of it. I was like, maybe there's nothing that I, have or nothing for me essentially. Like maybe this is it. This is like the end of the rainbow, I guess you can say, as far as like this study goes. Like I can just take Chicano history and like that's it. That's the full extent that I'm going to get. But then when I finally figured it out, which was not until like 4 years later, by the time I was in the CSU in Bakersfield, I was doing Spanish. I was majoring in Spanish. And like I said, there was something like missing. I was like, okay, I really like history. And, I have a passion for like language and Spanish. But like, what can I do that has anything to do with that? So I kind of hopped around. And I think, honestly, I went on like ChatGPT and was like, this is what I like. Like, tell me what I can do. And ethnic studies came up and I was like, okay, I think I read a little bit on it and I was like, hey, that sounds really interesting. Then I figured out that there was like a concentration. So you can do like Chicanx studies, Asian American studies. And I was like, okay, that's really interesting. And I think I had told my boyfriend about it and my boyfriend was going to be transferring to Sacramento State. And we'd been doing long distance for a while. So he was like, oh, like, do you want to come with me? And that was like one of the things that was like enticing, because he was like, you know, they had that thing that you've been talking about, the ethnic studies thing. And I was like, do they really? And he's like, yeah, they even have like the concentration, the Chicana studies. And I was like, oh, okay. And so, yeah, I went to Sac State with him with the intention of like right when I transferred there to just change my major to ethnic studies. And then I took my first semester, I think it was like 4 courses. I took Mexican American experience, excuse me, Pan-African studies, intro to ethnic studies, and ethnic America. So it was like full blown. Like I just went in because I was like, this is so interesting. I was excited. And luckily I have the best professors. All the professors that I took that semester were just really great. And then also I was super passionate about the subject once I was learning more about it. So it was just a really good semester. And that was really like my first take on ethnic studies. Like I said, I've never heard of it prior to that point, other than like little snippets, you know. Now realizing that it's a interdisciplinary study, I'm like, oh, okay, there was like little snippets that were really like calling my attention in like psychology or history or Spanish or whatnot, you know. But that was really that's really it. That's really what got me into ethnic studies. And then specifically like research was through Dr. Flores. He was teaching Mexican American experience. And I think his thing is like the education pipeline, like Latinos with the lower percentage, and then Chicanos with an even lower percentage on like master's or even bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and especially PhD degrees. So he was like, you know, if anybody wants to go into higher education, like please come into my office, come talk to me. And that was me. I was like, that's something I really want to do, especially with the statistics that he was giving me. I was like, okay, like this is something I really want to do. And I think I just met with him like right after class. I had asked him, and he was like, hey, are you interested in like going into like grad school? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, there's this conference, which was the NOX conference, the National Association of Chicana Studies, I think is what it is, in San Francisco. And he was like, you should go. I think you'd really like it. And so I drove to San Francisco. I went to the conference, and he kind of gave me the rundown on, you know, what these people do, and like not how easy it is, but like how doable it is, you know, with community and with help, and that he would help me. So that was really cool. And that's how I got into research. And he was really like, it was a really big opportunity. And he was awesome and like talking me and like guiding me, especially like as a first gen college student. So it was really cool. I'm really lucky to have him.
So far in your journey, what's something that you feel like you've really clinged on to or like has really stuck out? Because obviously doing research and learning like through all like a formal education, I'm sure there's some stuff that either you didn't know beforehand, or once you did learn and kind of like maybe you knew a little bit before, just like you can't help but always think whenever you interact. Like for me, I never took a Chicano studies class in college, but I did take an ethnic studies class. And to me, it just kind of opened me up more to sociology and like kind of like we were talking before the pod, kind of a little bit of like bursting my bubble of like, okay, like my experience doesn't necessarily dictate others' experience. Like just because maybe either something was hard for me doesn't mean it was hard for someone else, or just because something was easy for me doesn't mean it was easy for someone else who was also a full Mexican American or Chicano or whatever. You know what I'm saying?
So something that has stuck with me is a question, right? If I'm answering your question correctly, I would say like language, our experience with language, which is, it's just funny because I always bring it back to like no Sabo-ness.
Yeah.
But I think it's just because I'm most knowledgeable about that, because that's where I've done my research. But I think it's more so like this shift that I had, because I grew up, I would call myself like a no Sabo kid. To some extent, you know. And I think, I mean, in my research, I talk about like no Sabo-ness being a spectrum. And it really is, because I think when I was speaking to a lot of the individuals that I spoke to for like interviewing in my research, some of them were like, you know, I think of no Sabo, like a no Sabo kid as my childhood self, but my Spanish has since improved. Or I'm scared to become, like I've never have been a no Sabo kid, but I'm scared to become a no Sabo kid, or I'm scared that my children will become a no Sabo kid. So we all have like this connection to language and like this different perspective, I think. And mine before was that I grew up as a no Sabo kid. And my dad speaks predominantly Spanish. And so he was always working. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. So it was like not too much of a big deal that I couldn't speak perfect Spanish, because it was really with my dad that I spoke Spanish. It wasn't until I got older and I really wanted like a stronger relationship with my dad that I started to see the barriers, like, oh, okay, I cannot have a conversation with my dad. And one thing me and my dad share is like this like love for education and like knowledge and just knowing, especially about like Chicanos and Latinos and the history, you know, and why we are the way that we are, and ethnic studies essentially. And I couldn't share that with him. So I was like coming home from like these Chicano studies classes, and I was like, "Apa," like da da da, you know, and I would get stuck on a word because I was like, I don't even know how to say this. Luckily, I mean, he knows a little bit of English, so I'm like, how do you say this? And he'll guess. Or my mom, she's bilingual, like pretty much like better than either of us, like me or my dad. So she's pretty good at like, oh, this is what you mean, or like this is, or we just use Google. So something. But so that was my experience with like language. And so my take on language became like, I need to be fluent, like proper fluent. I need to know this like Castilian Spanish, or, you know, like the proper like Spanish or Spain Spanish, whatever you want to say, or whatever you want to call it. And so that was my approach first. And I then, when I started taking ethnic studies, I learned like all of the history behind that and the stigma behind like this idea of like purist or like proper Spanish. And then my take became different. And then I was like, okay, like I will speak like Chicano Spanish or Mexican Spanish, which is very different than a lot of anywhere, not even just like Spain Spanish, but like Puerto Rican Spanish or slang or whatever you want to call it. So I think what really has stuck with me is this idea of language. And at this point, I'm almost sick of it because I think I've looked into it too much. And I'm like, all right, like there's definitely more to go down the rabbit hole. But that's one that's really, really stuck with me, this idea or this relationship that we all have with language and how we've experienced it differently. And how we've approached it differently, like throughout our life, like from our childhood self to our like adult self.
It's true. There's a lot. Actually, I have a lot of questions. Like I can really deep dive into this. Well, over one thing, I guess, off the top of my head. So what are some things that you felt like, you said that like when you found out the whole properness of Spanish and maybe I guess I'm sure you found out Spanglish and how like even here, you know, like Americans, like, do you feel like it's important for a Mexican American to know Spanish?
No. I think because of my approach was like, oh, I need to know perfect Spanish. When I first started getting into my research, it was hard to navigate this idea of like, I think Spanish is very valuable, especially valuable to me because my relationship with my dad, and that's different for everyone, you know, it's not everyone. We all have very different experiences. And so I was trying to navigate this, like, how can two things be true at once? How can I value language, but also stand on this idea that language doesn't make or break your Latinidad or your Chicanidad or whatever, you know? And so, yeah, it was weird to navigate that. But when I finally, like, started taking ethnic studies classes, it was a lot easier because I was hearing other people's perspectives as well. I was hearing the history, not only like no Sabo-ness as an identity, but no Sabo-ness as like a cultural, what like in my research I call it like a cultural response to a whole bunch of things, to history, to experiences, like with our parents, migrating and whatnot. So just like that navigating, and I'm so sorry, now I'm like rambling, so I forgot your question.
No, it's okay. I just was asking, do you feel like it's important for a Mexican American to know Spanish? And I guess just more bouncing off like what you're saying, I think I have always like had a complex kind of relationship with that idea or answering that question, because I mean, obviously I was an Osabo and I relate so much to what you're saying. That's how I feel with my mom. I feel like I want to know my mom very intimately, and I feel like in order to do that, I need to better my Spanish. And I felt that when my grandma passed away, I felt like I wish I'd had a closer relationship with her, but I didn't have the tools in my Spanish to really build that. And so like that part of me wants to be like, then yes, it is important, because then if I then have kids one day and then I want them to communicate with their grandma, my mom, I would want them to know Spanish. But then there's that whole other section of just historically assimilation, you know. A lot of Mexicans come over and they want their kids to feel safe and feel like one of the Americans. So obviously they don't exactly push Spanish onto them, or even farther back, like some people would get hit for speaking Spanish or discriminated against. So then I'm like, well, then it's not to, if someone doesn't know Spanish, they're not necessarily to blame, nor do I feel like it lessens their identity. But it is kind of like, to me, a little bit of a mix. So I just wonder, what do you think as someone who has done the research?
Yeah, I mean, to reiterate, like, I definitely don't think that it makes or breaks your Spanish. I think I thought that in the past, but more so about myself, because there's a lot of shame that comes with, like, oh, I don't speak Spanish and you can't talk to your dad or whatever. So for me, especially, like, because of my own insecurities, my own shame, I think I kind of, like, exuded. Is that the right word? No, I don't think so. But I placed that expectation on other people, and I think that's where we go wrong. And like looking into my research, I was kind of like, okay, I'm one of the people that I'm talking about in this research. You know, these people who like who gatekeep essentially like Latino identity. And I see how it happens now, you know, because I was like, oh, I was going down that route where I did feel like my insecurities were really driving this idea of like, I need to know Spanish and it needs to be proper Spanish. And I need to like strive for perfection like every single time. And there's nothing wrong with improving your Spanish. That's like something that I reiterate like over and over in my research, because I want it to be clear that like these are two different conversations. In this conversation that I'm having about whether Spanish makes or break your Latinidad, I'm not arguing that it's invaluable or unimportant, because it is for many different reasons. But it's just this like, doesn't mean you're not Latino, you're not Mexican, or you're not Chicano if you don't know Spanish.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's really well said.
I guess I wanted
really
to add on to that.
Yeah.
Just because I mean, just as an observation that I have is, I mean, in our conversations and just listening to a lot of discourse that I see online or wherever it is, I think it's so interesting that when it comes to the Chicanx or the Latinx community, language seems so crucial. Like, I mean, I'm obviously I'm biased, right? I only really know English and Spanish, but I've never heard of or really heard anything of other languages really having such an impact on like how people relate to their culture. And like you guys are talking about, I understand like in certain aspects, of course it's important. Like if you can't communicate with somebody, like you're kind of, what can you do? But I think it's so interesting that for a lot of people, if the language isn't there, you're closed off completely. And I think that's such an interesting phenomenon, which is why I was so interested in your research. Because yeah, obviously when you sit down and you think about it, you're like, why does that happen? You know? And then I think it's so interesting because I like what you said, where you talked about how no Sabo-ness is a cultural response. I think it's interesting that there's so many people like yourself or other people or like Steve who really try their best to bridge that gap of I'm trying to learn so that I can access this culture. And when that occurs and it's not perfection, there's this label added to it that's negative. So I guess I wanted to see if you could speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, to the label specifically?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I mean, going back to like no Sabo-ness as an identity, but also as a cultural response, there's a lot of history behind why people don't speak Spanish, and we've kind of touched on it a little bit already. But it also, like, along with the history, it also comes with this, like, gatekeeping that we have in the Latino and Chicano communities, where people who are trying to learn Spanish are still berated. Like, even, you know, like, the community's like, you need to learn Spanish, rightfully so. You know, it's valuable. You want to keep in touch with your elders, speak to your parents, whatever it may be. And you're like, okay, I'll learn. And then you try and they're like, oh, never mind, but they laugh at you. You're ridiculed essentially. And you're not necessarily guided. They try to guide you, but it comes off very purist. Like, oh, it's not enough, or it's not the right Spanish or the proper Spanish. So there's like a lot of history, but it's also the culture that like the Latino community has, not everyone, but in general, has created that perpetuates further this idea that if you don't speak Spanish, you're not Latino enough or whatever. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
if you
definitely.
Look around if you need.
No, yeah, definitely. I also think it's so interesting too because when you're talking about like that purist idea of Spanish, I think it's so interesting because there's, like you said, there's so many subsections of Spanish. There's Spain Spanish, there's Mexican Spanish, there's
Puerto Rican
LA Spanish, there's New York Spanish, there's Puerto Rican Spanish. There's all kinds of like Spanish like subsections. I remember in high school I took AP Spanish, and we were watching this video. I forget which culture had this like little caveat, and there was this woman talking about how she got in a fight with her boyfriend because she, I think, was from Puerto Rico and he was from Mexico. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but they're from different Spanish speaking cultures kind of. And she said that the fight stemmed from her boyfriend saying, "Oh, I got to go do something. I'll call you ahorita." Right. And so she said that she was sitting by the phone waiting for him to call back, and he didn't. And so when they talked again, she was like, "Why didn't you call me back?" And he was like, "I don't understand why you're upset. I said I'd call you like ahorita." And she was like, "Yeah, that means you're going to call me right now, no?" And he explained that his Spanish, ahorita, means the hour like ahead. Like it doesn't mean right this second. It just means like this hour in the distance. And that's a small, like kind of innocuous kind of like interaction. But it's stuff like that where it's like when people talk about this pure Spanish that people need to speak, it's kind of a toying cost of what you mean with what that Spanish looks like. So I think that's very interesting, you know?
Yeah. It is interesting the way that because I think have you guys ever read Borderlands by Gloria Anzaldúa? No. So it's like people call it, or my professor calls it, Dr. David Flores calls it the Bible of like Chicano studies. I think it was written, when was it written? In the 1900s sometime. Like, I want to say anywhere, this is broad, but anywhere.
1900s.
I wish.
Yeah.
Later in the 1900s.
Yeah,
so, like, after the 1960s for sure. I think it was, like, in the 1980s. I could be wrong because I know I'm reading the 2012, like, updated, like, edition version. But it just has, like, because she's since passed, Gloria Anzaldúa. She was an author. But in one of her book chapter, she talks about language specifically. There's like a chapter dedicated to language, I believe, and she kind of lists like all of the different Spanishes that she's familiar with because she's Tejana, so she's from Texas, a Texas Chicana, and she's listing like Tex-Mex, Spanish, Spanglish, Chicano Spanish, like all of these like Spanish, like different ones, whatever. And she has this whole chapter where she talks about like language and like this like out Chicano each other, and this just applies to Chicanos, but like we can apply it, or she talks about Chicanos, but we can apply it to Latinos, like you're out Latinoing each other. I don't know if that's right.
Yeah.
But it's like, oh, my Spanish is more Latino or more just better in general, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, but it's a really good read.
Yeah, it's like you said, right? It's kind of people projecting their insecurities because it's like clearly like an identity insecurity, or just like in general being insecure of your own Spanish. It's like, well, at least I'm better than you, or I'm better than that guy.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I also think it's interesting too because it's like, I mean, maybe I don't know if you looked into this into your research, but I think it's interesting that when it comes to like Spanish slang, there's this very negative connotation towards it, despite everybody knowing what you're talking about, right? Like if you were to say el libreria, everybody's like, it's biblioteca, whatever. But everybody knows what you're talking about, right?
Or lonche.
Yeah, whatever. But
I'm like, what is the actual word then?
Yeah.
It's not lonche.
But when it comes to like English slang, even if it's like really strange, it gets added to the official Urban Dictionary, or it's so
word of the year,
like or everybody's using it, and it's the funniest thing, and it gets welcomed so quickly and like at light speed almost. And I'm curious as to why when it comes to Spanish it's absolutely no, but when it comes to English, everything's welcome.
I think it's the culture, really. And I think it's this idea, because in my research I do touch on this idea of, what is it called? I have no idea. I'm like, what is it called? Oh my gosh, how am I just blanking right now? Can you repeat your question?
Oh, I was just saying, like, why is it that when it comes to English, like slang or improper words will become welcomed into the language and they'll be added to the dictionary, become word of the year. When it comes to Spanish, despite everybody knowing what you're talking about, or it being a generational like word like libreria or lonche, Absolutely not. Not welcomed in the language,
Yeah.
not at all.
Okay, got it. Now I remember what I was going to say. Sorry.
No, no
But
worries.
so first and foremost, I think it's just a culture that we've created. I didn't look specifically into that, so I guess I can't directly answer your question. But like at least like behind the purist, right? I've identified that this comes from like purist ideologies, but where does that come from? You know, we can go down the rabbit hole. I don't think I've looked into that. But if I could indirectly answer your question, I would say that I cover this idea that like Chicano, like these ideas of different like Spanishes that we have in California and Texas, wherever, that it comes from like these adaptations of Spanish to honor new realities. And I think the fear, like just on what I've read, I think the fear comes from this like becoming distant from like our origins or like our origin, like country of origin. And I really think it's fear that drives like these gatekeepers to gatekeep. But it's, so when people start to adapt Spanish to honor their realities, because it's new realities that are happening, right? Like you're in a bicultural, bilingual system here in the United States, and it would maybe even be a stretch to say it's a bilingual system because it's not. But whether you're like home education, like wherever you are, you're speaking English and Spanish, however that might look for you, if you are bilingual, but that's not good enough, right? It's not close enough to like Spanish. And then we can even get into like Spanish as a colonizer's language. But essentially like right now, right, like Spanish is the like language, right, of Mexico, I guess you can say. And anything that deviates from that, people kind of start to panic, I think, because they're kind of like, oh, like they're forgetting or it means something to them and it brings about fear, I think. But I think it's like we need to start having the conversation about how these adaptations of Spanish are honoring these new realities of people. Like we cannot continue to go down this path of like it needs to be this way and only this way because it doesn't honor the realities. Like I said, you're in a bicultural system, speaking two languages, navigating between two cultures, this idea of like hybrid identity. And to speak Spanish is not on par, but it's just not even beneficial. I don't even know, for the lack of better word, I would just say like it's not aligned with the way that you live your everyday life. And to expect Chicanos or Latinos who live in the United States to speak perfect Spanish when they are immersed in a culture that is, or in a place that is bicultural, I think is not wrong. That's not the right word, but it's not fair.
Or realistic.
Yeah, there you go. It's not realistic. It's not.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I agree.
No, I love what you said about how it's honoring their reality.
Yeah.
I think that's a really powerful way to put it.
Well, I was gonna say, because I keep thinking about how even in Mexico, like Spanish is different depending on where you are.
I was literally gonna say.
Because I always think about, like if, to put it in perspective, like if you're living more in like the north side of Mexico, your Spanish is, I guess, in a way the like perfect Spanish.
Proper.
And like the proper Spanish, I guess. And then if you're more in like the south of Mexico, it's a lot more, what's the word? Like since it feels more like since they live in more like rural spaces, like their language is like more dialect. Like it's more just like, there's a lot more history and like of the native culture. Because there are a lot more native or I guess Mexican indigenous cultures there. Because that's how I've met the more, I guess, Latinos I meet. Like there's this one specific person that I've met, and when she speaks Spanish, it sounds like the Mexico City Spanish. And I'm just like, and I'm always like so in awe because I've only ever heard it in novelas. And so when she like starts talking, I'm like, oh my God, your Spanish is so like, I don't know, like it's just
proper.
It's just so proper. Yeah, professional. And like for me, that's where like my insecurities come from. Cause then like when she speaks like that, I'm like, and I know Spanish, like like how we said, like my parents both speak Spanish. I grew up on novelas. I grew up listening to mostly Spanish music. But when I hear her, it makes me feel like insecure of like, I don't sound like that. And I've never heard anybody speak to me directly like that. So then it just makes me like overthink when I speak Spanish, because I'm like, I don't sound like her, and like I'm standing right next to her, and like if we're talking completely different. Which is why I like to put that more into perspective of like when we move here, right? Like she's from here, she grew up here, but that's like how her family raised her. And like that's just like our own different experiences of like my parents grew up more in like a farmland, like that's just how they speak. Their parents were still, and their grandparents still knew like a lot of the indigenous languages. And so for me, I'm always like thinking of that, of like I can't be very self-critical when it's like that's just how we grew up, like that's not my own fault of it. And like for my parents, like they mostly just speak Spanish, so they chose to teach us Spanish. It wasn't until high school that I discovered that people had an issue of people who didn't speak Spanish. I mean, I grew up seeing the way like my brother was treated, but I never, like I was a kid.
That's just our family.
Yeah, I just thought it was like, that's just our, because I don't know, like when I went into high school, I think I always had this thought that just everybody who was Latino knew Spanish. And even with my with my little brother, it was like the same thing, even though like when we go to Mexico, like he would get made fun of. But I always thought it was like our accents. Like I always thought it was just because I had an accent. Like I felt like I had an accent when I would speak Spanish. Like and so I just felt like for him, like he has it stronger. So I was just like, oh no, like that's just what they're laughing about. They're not laughing that he doesn't know, or like he's an Osabo kid or whatever. And even then, like I didn't even know what Osabo was.
I don't think it existed.
So I don't think it really existed. Yeah. And so it wasn't until high school that I was with like my friends, and somebody made the comment that she didn't know Spanish. And then my other friend was like, well, then how do you talk to your grandma? And then that was the first time that I had seen like that interaction. But I didn't think about it that much until like more recently. And I was like, I guess like people genuinely like really judged you hard if you didn't know Spanish. But again, like that's just to say that like, I think there's just different things that we kind of grow up in, and like just where people all come from. It's just really different. Like even directly in Mexico, it's completely different.
Yeah, it's because you're unlocking like a memory for me. Because that is true. I never thought of that until right now. But I actually did not know that people didn't know Spanish, but were, I guess, self-identifying as Mexican until I got to high school. Because I remember specifically the first interaction I had was with one of my friends. I won't say their name, but I remember I asked like, oh, like and their parents were coming. They were getting picked up from high school, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna say what's up to your parents. And then I somehow mentioned something about speaking Spanish, and I think I said like maybe my Spanish isn't as good, so sorry ahead of time. And then he's like, oh, like my mom doesn't speak Spanish. And I was like, oh, really? I was like, oh, wait, what? I remember clearly it was like freshman year, and I remember exactly like we were studying right outside the high school, and it was the first time. And I guess because kind of similar, when we would go to Mexico, I would speak Spanish. Like we would be buying like in the city or something, and they would point me out. They would always be like, where are you from? And I'd be like, Mom, like I don't know, like I don't know if I should give my address, but my mom said like, oh, they know that you're not from here because of your accent when you speak Spanish. And it was so funny because I was such a confident kid that I remember thinking like oh, like I guess I just have like an accent from like southern Mexico or something. I didn't think like
passive aggressive too. Like, where are you from? Like, it's like face drops. Like, oh.
And they call you güero, so they were like de dónde eres güero? And I was like, how did you know? I remember I was like caught off guard that they somehow could just tell.
Yeah.
But like now as an adult, it's kind of funny because I was obviously this American ass kid like trying to speak Spanish, like me dos uno de esos, and then I was like, oh, how did they know I wasn't from Mexico? I remember I was mind blown. But yeah, like
how do we not blend in so easily?
I know.
Yeah.
No, seriously.
I guess like hearing you guys all speak on it, I was. No Sabo, like the title seems new. Is it new?
It's fairly new. I think before it was like Pocho or Pocha was like the No Sabo of like that decade, whatever decade. I think that was probably maybe like 10 years ago when that was like more of a thing, maybe 15.
But the phenomenon is
like I don't know if they necessarily call it like a phenomenon. In my research, I refer to it as like a phenomenon. But no Sabo, like the label is, I mean, it's just, it comes from like making the grammatical error, right? But people turn it into a label because
I would say
it defines you if you don't speak Spanish.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily like a new phenomenon. People have not been able to speak Spanish for years, you know, once they're like parents or families migrate to the United States or wherever that, like wherever it is. But no Sabo as a label, I think, is newer. Like to say, oh, you're no Sabo or no Sabo.
I think
it's the TikTok era.
Yeah, I think the TikTok era made it bigger.
Yeah.
Because I think it's sort of been around, and I remember like I would hear it here and there, but it was never like a label. Like this is what you label a majority of, like, I guess, kids who don't predominantly like speak Spanish.
But has that idea of like Puritan Spanish kind of been around? Like if you that's been around for long.
I think so. I mean, as far as I've like reading Gloria Anzaldua's book Borderlands, she talks about it, and that book, like I said, was written like I want to say like 80 something.
And she doesn't mention no Sabo.
She doesn't mention no Sabo, but she mentions like the idea, right? This idea of like speaking perfect Spanish. And there's a lot of like articles that I read where it's same thing, and they kind of don't go, at least not to the extent I guess that you want to read. Like it's not direct. You kind of got to read between the lines to understand like what they're talking about. And even though they're not saying, oh, no Sabo kid or no Sabo phenomenon, they're still talking about language as like this like key marker of Latinidad, whether they're for it or against it, whether they're fighting like, oh, you know, just casually like, oh, you know, this is why Spanish is important and this is why everybody should speak Spanish, or like just against it, I guess you could say. Not against it, but just like, oh, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, like I don't think the concept of no Sabo is for sure new,
but the relation of language to identity. Has
but
been around.
But I do think even that in of itself is really fascinating to me, at least personally. Like the label no Sabo and like the kind of self, like I don't know, like taking it back. Like a lot of people who are no Sabos or even on the spectrum of no Sabo, like taking it back. Because I remember in 2023 when we first had started the show, and we had Dominic on. And I remember he mentioned no Sabo, but he specifically said it. I love when I found out about no Sabo because I felt like I had finally been seen. And I don't know if you remember, but he said something like along those lines on that episode. Yeah. And I remember when he said that at that time, no Sabo was kind of new. So it's like pretty recent. I would say it's even within the past few years. And it's kind of cool because I think it does create like, I don't want to say subculture because I think that almost makes it feel like I am taking away a little bit of their like identity. But it builds like some kind of community that I feel like aids a lot of people that do fall on that spectrum. Because in my opinion, and I've said this before, I feel like it's more common that Mexican American kids are no Sabo. Like even if your Spanish is maybe better than the next, I still feel like you're, like you said, your Spanish isn't as good as somebody from Mexico. So therefore, you are technically a no Sabo. That's controversial, obviously. But
sorry, no, go ahead. Finish.
No, I was just gonna say.
I was just gonna like talk to the point that you just said, which is like Mexicans are like more likely to be a no Sabo kid, and I think that comes, or I've read that it comes right from the side, like our like Chicanos or Mexicans' relationship with the U.S. is like so distinct. I think it's very different than other Latino identities, Latin countries. Just because of the history, but like I said, you know, people say like, oh, you're Mexican, instead of saying like you're Latino. They just kind of like, oh, everybody who speaks Spanish is Mexican, and they just like tuck you under that umbrella. But I think that's like, oh my gosh, I just went blank again.
No, it's okay.
Sorry.
While you gather your thoughts, I guess like to add to like what you're saying. I guess that is true. I never even thought of that. That the Mexican experience or Mexican descendants here in America, their experience is unique as opposed to other Latinos. Not to say that makes us superior or anything, but I think that even geographically, to have the homeland, the home country, right next to the United States,
and a lot of the USB originally.
So I think that does build kind of like, at least to me, I don't know, this interesting relationship, and I can't really put it to words right now because I just had this revelation right now because you said it. But to me, it somehow makes more sense why, at least I think, when Mexican Americans come to America, they have this need to kind of shame other people for not knowing Spanish. Like it feels like because it's right there, maybe like you should know it because it's like it's just next door.
Yeah, sorry. So what I was saying was like the like our relationship. I wouldn't say like I guess unique could be a word, but I think people can like take that and run with it. Like, oh,
For
you
sure.
think you're better than
Yeah, for sure.
and there's
for sure.
already this like idea that like Mexicans think they're better than all other
Yeah.
Latinos. But like when you I think using unique, but I think distinct is a better word. I think our relationship, like Mexico's relationship with the United States, is distinct because it is.
Yeah.
The history, there's a long history behind it, and then a long history of like colonization, a long history of like Mexico. This was Mexico's land before, and then indigenous land always. But other countries, like Latin countries, a lot of them have also dealt with like the same issues that like Mexicans have also dealt with in the country, just in general, like on the basis of like colonization. But they've had almost different relationships in the sense of like they haven't been like, oh, you can't speak your language. Like they've always had their language in their country, if that makes sense. Mexico, which was once part of or the United States, which was once part of Mexico, like that area, the Mexicans didn't go nowhere. Like they were there when that happened, and they became like essentially like citizens overnight, and then were expected to assimilate, not necessarily by law, but by policy and by like social pressures, to assimilate. And so I think that already is kind of like, okay, that's very different. And then so once you look at like further generations, I think a lot of the research says like the third generation is really the biggest jump. Like that's when you start to really see people like the heritage language use decline. And so if you're looking at people who've been here for like decades, like their family's been here since before, you know, and they don't speak Spanish, and then to like berate those people and be like, oh, you're not Latino enough, I think just like waters down the Latino Mexican identity. And it's just, it just waters it down in the sense of like, it's a really complex identity. And I think to say, or to put it down to like Spanish as like the factor that defines it, ignores all of like the history behind it, because there is a lot of history. And that's what I mean by like distinct, is just really the history, but also like the social relationships, like history, like legally because of like land and, you know, all of that, and like schools and the banning of Spanish and yada, yada, yada. But that I think is what makes it unique. And I think people forget that like the relationship with the United States is, or like Mexico's relationship with the United States is very different. Not better, just different.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have anything, I guess, in your research that kind of might explain why there is this like idea of like Mexican superiority, like why Mexicans?
No, I didn't look into that. Like, no, I looked into Chicanos specifically when I started to talk about like this idea of Spanish as like the defining factor for Latinidad and Chicanidad, more so because of my own experience. Like I feel like I have a lot more insight into like the Chicano experience, and not saying that my experience encompasses all Chicano experience, but just like I'm a little closer to being able to define that versus Latino experience, just because it is so different, like I said, because it's distinct. And I really base that off of the like Chicano movement and Chicano identity as like being rooted in the Chicano movement. So I do focus on like the Chicano community, Mexican Americans, but I don't look too much into like why our specific thing. I just look into how language is different for us, or like unique for Mexican Americans, like our relationship to language because of our close relationship to the United States.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask, I guess, kind of just a slightly deviation in topic, which was, again, like how I mentioned earlier, I was surprised that there was like a place for this in academia. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, because you focused on language, was the X that people
Oh,
use
yeah.
and Chicanx or Latinx.
Mhm.
I know that for a lot of people, that's very controversial.
Mhm.
And I've seen some very like harsh pushback on that.
Yeah.
And I guess I wanted to pick your brain a little bit of what
Just what do you think about
what do
that?
you
Yeah.
think about
Yeah.
that? Like, where does that come from? Like everything under the sun that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was a thing until my first semester at
Yeah.
Sac State with Dr. Flores. I think he brought it up just like that. Like, hey, people say this. Like, what do you guys think? I think he just
Yeah.
kind of wanted everyone to talk amongst themselves, and
Yeah.
so we did. And I think the way that he explained it, I was against it because I was like, well, that's not fair. And the way that I believe if I'm remembering correctly, he had explained it like a lot of people, like one of the controversies behind it is that X, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's like something about X, like the letter in the Spanish language is difficult, or it's like not right, or like it's
Yeah,
difficult
I
to
think
say.
The X sound isn't pronounced that way.
Yeah. Oh, that might be it. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so it was kind of like, okay, if we're using this to refer to all Chicanx's or Latinx's, but it's like not honoring the Spanish language, and why are we using it? That's not what he said, but that was my thought process, right? Because he had mentioned like, these are the controversies, and he like listed them off. And so I was like, okay, like I raised my hand. I was like, yeah, no, because if it's not, but like I said, after learning some, I'm not for it and I'm not against it. I use it in my research exclusively, or not exclusively, like when I'm talking about other articles that I've read and they use Latino or Chicano, like the A or the A. What did I just say? The A or the A? Oh my gosh, the O or the A. I was like Spanish, English at the same time. For Latino and for Chicano or Chicana and Latina, I will refer to it as that, like if they use it that way. But if they use Latinx, I will use it that way. But when I'm just talking about my research, I use Latinx and Chicanx for my research. So I'm not for it. I'm not against it. Like even learning that like it doesn't necessarily follow like grammatical rules in Spanish. I'm like, nobody follows the grammatical rules in Spanish. Like that's essentially what we're like arguing for. So I'm kind of like, if people, like we all know what we're talking about, so it doesn't matter, and I think people feel like there's also Latine now. Latine, that's a new one. I just like the way, to be honest, I just like the way that sounds. Like Latine sounds cool.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they have one for Chicano or Chicane. No, I don't know. But yeah.
Well, at least a little bit that I learned about like Chicanx, and then I mean, you could probably talk about this because in college, that's where I also learned about. Well, I had always heard about like the Chicano movement and all that stuff. But it wasn't until college that I met more people who started adding the X, more specifically to Chicanx. But people also use it in the beginning instead of changing.
I had seen that, but I didn't even think about that. But it looks cool.
I remember in high school, and that's when I learned about. Have you ever seen it? And you know how Chicano is spelled Chicano. Instead of the CH, you replace it with an X. That's what you're talking about, right? And in high school, I remember that was the first time I heard about it too, because I had these friends who were from Boyle Heights, and they were very like about Chicano, and like they knew about the history, and they would always be dropping proverbs on me. And he told me that, I don't know if this is true, I've never fact checked this, that the X apparently in some indigenous language makes like the cha sound, and that's why it's spelled with the X to kind of put some indigenous representation in Chicano.
Yeah, well, because I think they used to say like is it Mexico? It was like Mexica or something like that.
Mexica?
It's Mexica, but it's with the X.
Yeah, Mexica, and then it's with the X. So then I think they said that in the movement, that's why they had added the X in the beginning for like at least during the Chicano movement. The only reason like I guess I looked it up was because I was going through like I guess an identity crisis when I was in college. More to do of like how I identify myself, whether I identified myself as just Mexican or Mexican American, but then I met friends who identified as Chicana, and so then I was kind of like I was just more of like I don't know what to identify, because I know Chicana and like the history is because of Mexican Americans, which is what I am, but then I'm like I don't know the full history, so I can't identify myself that way. And so then I was like, I'm gonna do my research. And I like the X, like I like the history of it. The only thing that I always had against it was just that like I more saw that, and this is again myself, I more saw that as like that's an honor for them. I wasn't part of that movement, so I feel like I can't take that on. And so that was the crisis that I was kind of going through. And then I was just like, I'm gonna just say Mexican American, but because for a long while I used to say Mexican. No, actually, I used to say Mexican American, and then people would always be like, "Oh, who's American in your family?" And I'm like, "No, both my parents are from Mexico." And I used to get that a lot. And so then once I continuously got that a lot, I would just say Mexican. And then they'd be like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I'm like, "Oh, like my family is from like Puebla." And then they'd be like, "Oh, so you're not from there?" I'm like, "No, I'm from here." And so then that's why I always had like that like challenge with myself. And then once I met like the whole Chicana and Chicanx and all that stuff, I was just like, I have no idea. And then eventually I was like, you know what? I'm going to say I'm Mexican American. If somebody continues to be like, who's American in your family? I'm like, me. Okay.
Yeah.
But I always had that like, I guess sort of crisis when that all happened. But that was like something that I searched in like what the X meant in like Chicanx, but in the beginning of it.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask, because like, I guess this was my own experience, but for you, how was it growing up in Bakersfield compared to like moving to Sacramento?
It was a culture shock. There's a lot of Latinos. I would even argue that a lot of the Latino population in Bakersfield is Mexican. I don't know the exact statistics, but I did read somewhere that Bakersfield is like 52% Latino. Not so sure about the Mexican, or like the Mexican population. But there's also, this I actually did get from a website, and I forget what it's called, but it's a credible website. I don't know what year this statistics are, but it was large Latino population and a very large immigrant population. So we can kind of assume that the immigrant population is largely Latino. The difference really was how many Latinos were in Bakersfield versus Sac. And I grew up in Bakersfield my whole life, and my parents were really like the traveling kind, so I was always in Bakersfield. I didn't go anywhere. We would take like drives maybe to like LA, but I didn't like go anywhere. Like I didn't get out much. If I got out, it was because I went with like my aunt somewhere, and she was taking like my other cousins to like SeaWorld or whatever the heck we were going as we were growing up. So I didn't get out much, and I didn't travel outside of California until I was like 21. I went to Vegas. Yeah. Not to drink. I just happened to be 21 or I think, was I 21? I don't know. It might have been 20. But me and my boyfriend had just gone with his mom because I think they had something in Vegas. I don't know what it was. But that was the first time I'd left California. So anyways, the point is I haven't lived anywhere else. I grew up in Bakersfield my whole life, 23 years. And then I moved there just after I had turned 23. I'm going to be 25 this year. And when I first moved over there, I remember, because there's a lot of Asians that live in Sac, a lot of white people and a lot of black people. And I think when I got there, like growing up in Bakersfield and being like in this bubble, and frankly, like enjoying it, I feel like when I had left and I was alone, I mean, I had my boyfriend, but I was alone, and I'm very close with my family. So when I moved over there and I didn't see anybody that like I could relate to or even feel like at home, like look around and be like, oh, okay, I feel at home. It felt weird. Like I was like, oh, this is really weird. And I think it was like the first thing I noticed when I moved up. First thing I noticed was probably how many trees there were out there. And I was like, oh, this is so nice. Because Bakersfield is dead. Yeah. It's flat. It's yellow. Like trees are dying. It's really hot. I mean, it's still hot in Sacramento, but they got like rivers there. So it's nicer. Trees are huge, green, whatever. So that was the first thing I noticed. The second thing I noticed was probably like, oh my God, where are all the Latinos at? And that was probably the biggest, like, I guess you can say culture shock. Yeah. I don't know if you want to poke around at that, but.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, because I had the same, I was in San Francisco, and like how I mentioned before earlier. And I also had the culture shock because majority, there's a lot of Vietnamese places there. Course majority, like a lot of white people there. It was interesting though, because I could see the diversity, but it still felt like I was alone, like there wasn't that many, I guess, Latinos. Eventually, like I found, you know, like the different clubs and organizations and stuff. But I was going to touch into more of like, because for me, when I went to San Francisco, that's where I lost my Spanish. Because I stopped being in like my household, which is like talking to my parents like every single day. And I did have my friends who were Latina, but we would talk very slang. Like they were, and so for the most part, my Spanish was like a lot of like profanity. And I was like, I can't talk like that with my parents. Like I can't be like saying that to them. So I remember the first time they picked me up, it was like for my birthday or something. And I started stuttering in Spanish, and I had never really stuttered before. And I was just like, I can't talk. Like, and I generally was, again, another crisis where I was like, oh my God, I like completely lost my Spanish. Like, I was so disappointed. And I just wanted to know if like you, I guess, sort of went through something like that, or if like how you were able to, I guess, going from that difference of like growing up somewhere where it was predominantly, you know, Latino to going somewhere where it was like completely different.
Yeah, I think my language ebbs and flows, really. When I was doing my research, I spoke to Dr. Flores' older brother, Hector Flores, from Las Cafeteras. And he said something that I was like, oh, I really resonated with that. He had said, I don't speak English or Spanish good. Like, he doesn't. And I was like, oh, that's cool, because that's true. I mean, we get on ourselves for not speaking perfect Spanish, but sometimes I can't speak English. Like, sometimes I'm like, there's times where I'm speaking and I'm trying to say something in English and I don't know the words, so I say it in Spanish. Like, I think one of them is like, I always like ansias. When you get ansias, like I feel like I cannot say that in English and it doesn't make the same sense to me. Or when you get calambras or calambres. Yeah. And I'm like, how do you say that in English? You know, so there's things that just
asco.
don't.
Me da asco.
Yeah, and I don't know like, I'm nauseous. Like, I just, you know what? I think like yesterday I had said something like that. Like, I was like, me da asco. How do you say ascos in English?
No, I literally always think
I was
of
like,
that.
oh, nauseous. But it doesn't give the same
feel.
Yeah.
It's not the same
it
feel.
doesn't. So
it's like it gives me the ick.
Yeah.
I'm
there you go.
nauseous. But it, like, my language acquisition ebbs and flows. Sometimes I speak really well and I'm like surprised with myself. I'm like, oh, like I'm talking to my dad and I'm just like that. And I'm like, wow, I can speak really good Spanish right now. And then the next day I'm like, oh my God, I can't even talk. But specifically, like when I had moved, I don't think so. I mean, for sure. I think now that I go back, when I was just moving to SAC, and I had known I was moving maybe like 2 months, not even 2 months, maybe like 2 weeks before I had actually like made the decision to be like, yeah, I'm going to SAC. I was starting to I started to figure out what ethnic studies was, and I had just changed my major to Spanish. And so I was like on this, like, okay, I had finally understood that, Spanish doesn't make or break me, but like I still think it's very valuable, especially with my relationship with my dad. And so I really wanted to be better at it. And so I started to really build that relationship with my dad, get closer with my mom, like talk to them on a daily basis, try to talk to them in Spanish. Because I think everybody's parents tries to get to talk to them in Spanish when you're growing up, and you're just like, ugh. Like my mom's like, if you don't speak to me in Spanish, I'm not going to answer you, or you can only speak Spanish to your dad and English to me, like all of this stuff, right? They try to get you to any way that they can, right? And so finally I myself had realized, you know, I'm an adult, they can't make me speak Spanish, but I had finally realized like this is something I want to do. And so I was making like a proactive effort I made that decision, you know. And so when I had left, I think, when I do come back, there's times where I'm like talking to my dad and I'm like, oh, like it was so good. Like yesterday, it was so good right before I had left, because I was really getting into the habit of like speaking, not even just like knowing the vocabulary, but speaking correctly, like in the right like sentence structure, versus like sometimes it's just, or even like the endings, like sometimes I mess it up, like calambras, like, and I'm like, that sounds right, and I'm like, oh no, it's calambres, you know? So it's like little stuff like that that's like my dad, and then my parents, like I think they've noticed. I've never been like, oh, I try to get my Spanish better, but I think maybe in like just talking to them about like what I'm passionate about and language and what I've learned, they've kind of come around, or not come around, but they've just like noticed that I try to improve my Spanish, and they're really good about just pointing it out. Like my dad's like, like if I were to say calambras, he's like calambres, and then I keep talking.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no like this stop, like hold on, you said it wrong, like, you know, or anything like that. It's very much just like fluid now, and it's like part of our daily like thing. And I think when you own it, and that goes for like language and identity, like how you were saying, like you don't want to like identify with Chicana because you didn't know, you know, like, or people were asking like, oh, who's American in your family? I think those things become a lot easier when I think you just become confident in yourself and you don't pay any mind, because I think people reciprocate what you're like, how you're feeling or how confident you are. And when you're just kind of like, this is who I am, like unapologetically, this is who I am, they just accept it a lot better. You're still going to get people who poke at it. But for the majority of the time, I think most people are just kind of like, oh, okay, she's confident in herself. Then like we can moving on, you know, like there's not much that's like, there's not much attention that's given to it. And then even if there is, and you answer them back very quickly, like, well, I'm American, that's why I identify as Mexican American. People don't know what to do with that because they're like, oh shoot, you know, people just like to poke. And I think when you give them that power, they continue to do it. But yeah, and so with my parents, not that they were ever not like that, like not like very supportive, because my parents are great, but in everybody's family, everybody makes fun of everybody, you know? But just that I've noticed that they're very good about just pointing something out. Like if I said it wrong and then I say it right, or I'll even be like, oh, how do you say that? Like, apa, like como lo dices, and he says it for me. I repeat it, and then he'll continue to repeat it until I get it, and then we move on. Like it's very like fluid. We just go. So yeah, to answer your question, I definitely have come back and been like, oh, like I was going, like we were going on a good run there. Like my Spanish was getting better, and then now that I live in SAC, I don't have anybody to speak Spanish with. I speak more slang. My boyfriend doesn't speak Spanish, but I'll speak slang with him. Like sometimes I'll throw like Spanglish in there, but for the most part, it's with like if I call my mom or I call my dad. But it's not the same. But I mean, that's how you deal. How you figure it out.
Yeah. I mean, what you said also is also like beautiful about like you should just own your identity, own your language. And I think that's something that a lot of people should hear and like, you know, come to terms with. I came to terms with it eventually. I was like, I'm Mexican American. I'm still like eventually maybe I'll be Chicana, but for now I'm still just Mexican American, and I like saying that. And with my Spanish, I'm teaching my boyfriend Spanish because he doesn't know either. And like, he's really trying to like learn so he can talk to my parents a lot more. And I'm like, and sometimes I'm very impressed with myself. I'm like, I sound really good.
It's my turn next, dude. I'm gonna pop out the Duolingo. Or isn't Duolingo controversial now?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Is it really?
Yeah,
I have never been on it, but how
they said that they're AI first, that they want to be AI first, and everybody didn't like that.
Didn't they come out as a language app first? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, but they said that they want to, I guess, I don't know
just
how that looks
shifting
like.
gears or something.
Yeah, they want to use AI only, like, and their stuff.
Apparently they're going through a rebrand. They deleted all their stuff off like social media too, like, and they have no profile picture. Yeah. So they're apparently completely changing. So I missed it. I missed the gap. So I guess I'm not learning, guys. Or Julie, put me in the next class.
You know what? Spanish music. That's how I learned Spanish. Like when I went from like not knowing Spanish well to like bettering my Spanish was music, because I was super insecure about it when I was, I think, in high school. I think like by my sophomore or junior year, I was like, oh, I gotta like learn Spanish. I was super insecure about it. I wanted to talk to my dad more. And so I started listening to Spanish music, and I had like the big box TV at the time. I didn't even know how I would connect to the TV, but I would connect my phone or a laptop or something. I didn't have a phone, I don't think so. Probably my laptop, I don't know, to the TV to get the lyrics on the TV in Spanish, and then use something else to translate on my phone and like read it and go on my phone and then look up like lyrics for da 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 in English, and then I would match the words, and I'd be like, oh, that's how you say that, that's how you say that. That's how I learned. Not very well, but it worked in terms of like getting my vocabulary up.
Yeah. I think it does work. Honestly, I think I sell myself short. I think my Spanish has gotten a lot better over the years, especially because I work with my dad now, and so I would say about like maybe like 70% of the customers who come only speak Spanish. So I do a pretty good job now, and it was cool because one time this dad came, like this older Mexican dad came, and I was speaking to him in Spanish, and he's like, wow, like your Spanish is really good. And I was like, it's not, but thank you so much. And then
you couldn't knock, you knocked yourself. You should have been like, thank you.
no, it was cool because he was, and then I said that, I actually did say that. And he's like, no, for real. It's like my kids don't know Spanish, and like, you know it really well. And so, and you're doing yourself a disservice. Like, you speak it really well. And it felt like a dad really telling me like that I was doing a good job. So from that point on, I was like, you know what? Maybe I'm not that bad. And I spoke a little bit more confident Spanish nowadays. And it's cool because sometimes we get like, you could tell some people who are here for like a job, like either a visa, but they just speak strictly Spanish. And it's cool because they'll be repping like a Honduras flag or something. And like we communicate. And like, I think what really shifted for me is that I used to be very robotic with my Spanish, but now I've really like kind of ingrained my personality into it. Like I kind of, because I joke a lot in English, so now I joke a lot in Spanish with them, and like sometimes I make them laugh, and I'm like, all right, we're making progress, we're making progress. So it's slowly working, and but I'll still do practice. So why not? What's bad with learning a little bit more, you know?
Yeah. I also learned through music. Like I used to, and also novelas, but I would put the subtitles. And then when there was a word that I didn't know, I would ask my mom, be like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And then she would tell me.
I am getting more into like corridos. I don't know what it is, but recently I've been like on a trend of liking like a lot of corridos when I'm driving, like Chalino and stuff. Yeah. But I'm not gonna glorify the lifestyle. It's just cool. It's just good music.
It's a way.
Good music is good music, right? But I guess kind of moving the conversation a little bit more. Beyond like the language research, was there anything else to you that you kind of like really stuck out to you that you enjoyed to learn about, or was kind of like shocking to learn about?
Yeah, like just in general, like
just
besides
in
the
general,
research.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of things. So like language was a big one, but like moving off the topic of research, because the research that I did was really focused on mostly language and history. I'm taking a class, or I just took a class this semester called La Mujer Chicana. And I thought that one was so cool because I'm taking that with Doctora Nancy Juante Sinsun. Her name is so dope. I just gotta say it all.
That is really cool name.
But she's so dope. But I took that with her this semester, and it's really like Chicana Feminism, like a class on Chicana Feminism versus like Mexican American experience. I think I've taken, what else? Have I taken any other Chicano studies classes focused? I can't think of them right now, but that was like the first Chicana feminism one, like specifically on like mujeres, a focus on mujeres. And we're reading this book called I think it's like a book for brown girls with sharp edges and tender hearts, I think is the name of it. But it's essentially a Chicana, or it might be a Latina, who's talking about like her experiences growing up in like Latino or Mexican culture. And she talks about colorism. And that one, just because I resonate. But other than that, I just thought it was super interesting. This idea of like colorism and where it comes from, and like this, like how colorism is like embedded in our culture in like hidden ways that you receive, and it might not be directly, but it really shapes you, and you don't realize it until you talk about it or until you read about it, and you're like, oh my God.
Like, and what's an example?
Like an example, let me think.
If you could think of one.
Maybe like, I can't think of a direct example, but like this idea that like if you have lighter skin, you're more attractive or whatever it might be, right? And okay, yeah, for example, like novelas, right? Like we have La India Maria, I think is her name, right?
Yeah.
And she's portrayed like very like indigenous, but like very ditzy, very like crazy, not very smart, you know. And she looks indigenous, or she is indigenous, and they give her like, you know, the stereotypical indigenous look. And then you have like the Latina or Mexican women who are lighter complected, and they're like in the same show. I've never watched like India Maria. This is something that was just like said in the book, I believe. Yeah, or I think it was talked about in class, either in the book or in class. But essentially like this like portrayal of like darker skinned Chicanas, or just women in general, as like dumb or not as attractive to like whiter, lighter complected Chicanas or Latinas. And I thought that was really interesting. And then how that's like fed to us in like everyday culture. You don't, like I said, they're not telling you, sometimes they do, but they're not telling you directly that you're less desirable or less attractive or dumber because, or they think you're dumber because you have darker skin. But it's like you don't see yourself portrayed like on screen or in certain instances. And so you're like indirectly like, hey, never see people that look like me portrayed as like the beautiful woman like in the novela or whatever. I'm more painted like La India Maria. I'm ditzy, I'm dumb, I'm, you know, not as attractive. And it's very interesting. But I thought that was super interesting, like just the topic of like colorism within the Mexican and Latino communities.
No, yeah. I mean, I ask you, but I mean, I know obviously exactly what you're talking about. Like, it's pretty common. I think one thing that people hear over and over, especially now that it is becoming summer, I think growing up, a lot of kids are like, "Oh, don't stand too much in the sun, or else you'll get too dark." Like that's like a common one that people casually say. I almost feel like you. It's funny to ask for an example that I asked for an example because I almost feel like you don't need to. Like anybody, I think who would listen to this
they know.
they know exactly like what is being said, and it's crazy because I guess the historical context of that, you know, like Mexico was always indigenous land, and then you know Spaniards came, obviously lighter complexions, and this whole like push on like more Eurocentric features in general. But what I find most interesting was when people aren't aware of it and they're just like, it's just how things are, bro. What do you mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah, like it's like you don't like you gotta read between the lines to realize that like the things that people say are not okay. Like, and I guess like, you know, people are like, oh, like it's not that serious, and to some extent, like sure we can just kind of like brush it over, but for some people it is serious. And I think you're lucky. Consider yourself lucky if you don't think it's that serious to talk about this. Because it really shapes, like I said, these like experiences shape who we are, and you don't know it shapes you until you talk about it later on. Like for example, like growing up, I'm not like I'm pretty tan. I'm not like the tannest, but I burn easily, like in the sun, like I tan really easily. And so I would get a lot tanner in the summer, like you usually do. And there's just things that people say that you're like, you take that and you start to internalize what that means. And it might not be like necessarily like they're not telling you like, oh, being darker is ugly or it's not as pretty as being like lighter skinned. That's not necessarily what they're indirectly saying that by saying like, you walk in the room, they're like, oh my God, you got dark, you know? Or don't go in the sun, stay out of the sun, you know? And the book talks about like she talks about her mommy, like the individual, the woman who wrote the book that I was talking about, the Brown Girls, or the book for brown girls, talks about her mommy telling her to get out of the sun, to wear sunblock. And she talks about how like that sounds very endearing. You think like maybe my mom doesn't want me to get skin cancer, to get out of the sun, you know, but she's like, that's not what she meant. Like she meant like, do not get darker because you won't be as desirable, or, you know, you'll just have a harder time with people if you're darker, you know, whatever it may be. And so there's like these things that people say that I don't think we realize that like have a lot of meaning, especially like growing up. I can only speak for myself, but like as a young girl, like growing up and hearing like things said like that indirectly, and I still struggle with it. And I think a lot of us still struggle with whatever it is, colorism, language, whatever it may be, like hair texture. When people say things indirectly to you, it shapes who you are. And that's why when people say like it's not, you could be like, hey, yeah, it's not that serious, but it's like, no, it is that serious, because like that's made me who I am. You know, those experiences are what has shaped me and how I view other people, and how just your walk in life, how you treat other people. I think like our traumas or our experiences really shape how we like approach other people and how we engage with other people.
Yeah, definitely, because I think that's how you kind of get this normalization of kind of like racism within the Mexican community. Like you see that there's kind of this lack of empathy towards people who are darker skinned, and it makes sense because it's most of the things that are said that are like, oh, stay out of the sun, or kind of passive aggressive ways of telling you that darker is worse. It's said to kids, and kids are very impressionable, and I think you grow up and so you build it and it becomes an insecurity when there's not anything wrong with darker skin. If in fact, you could argue that is more kind of just natural to Mexico because of like where it is on the equator and because of the history of just indigenous culture. Like that is what's supposed to be. Like that's what your skin is supposed to be.
Yeah, we were made that way too,
Yeah.
for our environment essentially. So it's like, why
Yeah.
are we gonna? It's just interesting. And then
Yeah.
we have like people who are lighter complected wanting to get tan skin, and it's like, oh, it's okay for them because they have like blonde hair and blue eyes and they want to get tan. But it's like you have like a brunette with brown eyes and she's tan, and you're like, oh no, you know. So it's just, it's so backwards.
Well, I think it's an interesting and yeah, just interesting to look at it because it's like the community is seemingly like being reared under a microscope, where it's like the way you speak needs to be perfect. Don't get too dark. And then we've talked about it before, where the Latinas they'll talk about like the body hairs, and there's so many things that get picked apart. Where when you really look at it at a grander scale, it's like, well, this is just like the way people are.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the way people speak. I mean, that's just how they speak. You know, people grow up the way they grow up, the way the people's color is. I mean, what can you do? You know, you can't really do anything.
Yeah.
People's body hair, you know, what can you do? And at a certain point, it's like you're just picking at the way people just are.
Yeah.
You know, and that's sad because it's like I think it removes a lot of potential where there could be a very strong unison in community.
Yeah.
And I think because of all these like kind of nitpickings and like gatekeepings and all these things, there sometimes it can feel like the community is a little what would you call it, like divided on thin ice with each other, kind of like walking on eggshells around each other, which sucks because I think there could be a very strong community like bond there. But
Yeah, I think it's like it's our proximity, like everybody's proximity or everybody's strive for proximity to like whiteness, and like whether that's like physically, like educationally, right? Like the education system, and you speak proper English, and if you're a Mexican and you have an accent and you don't sound white, like you're not educated, or did you really get a PhD, or you know, it's like all about this like proximity, getting closer to whiteness. And you know, the white people do it to us and then we do it to each other. And it's like, oh, why are we doing that? You know, it's like how, it's like, yeah, it's like this, like, okay, how close can we get to like being white? And it's just, it's interesting dilemma. That's really it.
No, it really is. And I think it's all rooted for sure in colonialism. Like it's definitely just decades and decades of colonialism, and nobody ever. Oh, what's annoying, I think, to me, or frustrating? Maybe frustrating is the more sophisticated word to say, not annoying. But I think to me, it's like once you educate yourself truthfully in like the history of Mexico and Mexicans in terms of colonialism, it becomes very obvious that a lot of these social issues or culture issues that we have are rooted in colonialism. But when you're brought up, then you're demonized as like, oh, that's like thinking about it too deep, or it's not that deep, or taking it too seriously, or like you're trying to be white. Like it's like there's this kind of like demonization of being educated. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like so it's kind of frustrating because you try to educate yourself and then educate others, but it's demonized for being educated.
Yeah.
You don't know until you're like in it. Like, for example, I wouldn't have thought that all of those things have mattered to me until I spoke about it. And then you're like, and I guess some people will say like, oh, it's not that deep. Like you're only now feeling that way because other people are telling you to feel that way, or, you know, but like when emotions come up when you're talking about this, you realize like, no, it is that deep.
Yeah.
Like I just now have the language and the knowledge to uncover what that really meant for me and to dismantle whatever it is belief that I've been made to feel about myself because of my darker skin, because of my darker hair, my darker eyes, or my effed up Spanish, like whatever it is, you know, you start to like uncover and peel back those layers when you get into history and what all of that means and why people do this to each other, why our people do this to each other. And you're just able to deal with it. And I think like it's liberating. Some people think it's like depressing, and I'm like, it's not depressing. It's like to some extent when you face those like traumas, I guess you can say, it is like for a moment you're kind of like, oh, but after that you feel so liberated because then you're not insecure about the things that you used to be insecure about. You become proud because you're like, this is a history of my people. This is why we're darker skinned. Like we're closer to the equator. Like we were made this way for our environment. Why would I feel any sort of like, not resentment, but why would I feel bad about like who I am? You know?
That's true, because it is like kind of like you reawaken that almost connection, like an ancestral connection of like, now that I know and I understand the history and I understand why people are the way they are, in a way it's like justice, maybe who knows how long, but like, and then when I think colonialism and stuff and how people still suffer through it, if I know, at least that's one person who knows, that's one person more than it was yesterday, right? And I think something is beautiful about that. So you're right. It is something that you could get depressed about, but if when you really think about it, it is liberating. Yeah. It is like, wow, like now I understand, and I have the ability to maybe not push this message on that too strongly, but at least like have some understanding when I speak to other people who are in my community, and be like, well, why do you think that? Like if somebody is colorist, like, you know, ask them about their beliefs, why, and then maybe slowly guide them into like, but are you sure that's really the way you should be thinking? Because I think that's the only way to heal a community, and maybe like it's not a Mexican American or anybody's responsibility to heal the whole community. But I think that if you're aware, it probably does some good to like let somebody know when they are being colorist or when they are being a little too harsh on their no sabo kid, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Like, I guess to add on it, because I really like what you said too. I guess the way I think about it too is like, because touching on how you talk about like the proximity to whiteness, and then how you bring up like the effects of colonialism. When I think about like language and people struggling with their Spanish, you know, I'm always like, but like I don't understand like punishing somebody for making an attempt to reconnect to their culture. I mean, when you look at it, Spanish and English are both colonizer language that were forced upon these people. You know what I mean? And then when these people are taking it back and kind of making it their own, like you said, like bringing their reality into their language, I'm like, how can you punish them for that? You know, like everybody's a product of their environment and, you know, what's happened to them, you know, and I, like you said, it's liberating because not that long ago, there were the schools that would punish indigenous children for speaking in their native language. I mean, we talked about it. I talked about on this podcast, like I think it was like 3, 4, 5 episodes ago, where in Canada they would send child services to forcibly take indigenous kids and adopt them out to white families. So there's this long history of forcing language, forcing culture onto people. I personally think it should be celebrated that there's still people who, in spite of all that, are really trying their best to reconnect, be more knowledgeable about it, you know, bridge those gaps. So that's why I'm always like, I think you should go easy on the people who don't speak, because while it may not seem deep, it obviously is. You know, there's so like people just didn't fall out of the sky, you know. But yeah, that's mostly what I had to say.
Well said, dude. Well said.
I guess to wrap up the episode, my last question for you is, I know we've asked you a lot about like your research and like what you've learned. If there's is there anything that you learned that you feel like more people should know about or take home with them?
This is kind of specific to ethnic studies, but this idea of community, I think, it's central to ethnic studies specifically. And when I say community, I guess like the importance of community. To be in community is so, I don't think it's understood until like you're in it. I've said that a lot, but I think when you're actually experiencing these things, instead of someone just telling you like, oh, hey, community is important, you're kind of like, hey, what does that mean? And it's not until you go out and you're in community or whatever it is that you're doing that you realize how important it is or how valuable it is. And for me, I feel like that was my experience being in ethnic studies, and a lot of the professors pushing this idea of like how community is so important. And to some extent, I was like, I understood it, but I was like, okay, you know, I took it with a grain of salt when I first heard it, even though it was like this like pillar of ethnic studies. And then I go out in my community, like working with Nopal the organization in Stockton, or based in Stockton, which is ran by Dr. Nancy Huantesinsun, and then also the co-founder, Dr. Ricky Maldonado, who he's not from Stockton, but they're very close friends. They founded that organization together. Being with them and interning there and going to like protest and just talking with other people and doing the work, getting your hands dirty, doing the work that matters, and being in community, being surrounded by culture, by people who look like you, who love you, who share the same passions as you, I think just opens up a new door in terms of like being rooted in like what really matters. And I think it's just important for people to understand that if you go out and you're in community, it opens so many doors in terms of like resources. You get a lot of help, whether that's like physical help, like resources in terms of like mental resources. And we have, I don't even know what would be the right word, but like physical resources, like food, help, rides, like carpools, whatever it may be, or people who point you to resources that matter, like how important that is, and how important it is for social change specifically. To fuel change, when you make connections with other people, like the way that we've been doing now, and other people hear about it, like you're able to collaborate to stand in solidarity for the things that really matter, the injustices that are happening today, that will continue to happen, sadly. And yeah, just the idea of community has really stuck with me. And I hate to like say it this way, because I think it's, like I said, you have to experience it. And no matter how much somebody tells you how important it is, it's not until you go out there and you're in community with people doing the work that matters that you really realize how important that is and the kind of things that it does for the change that we need. And yeah.
Wow, really well said.
Yeah, incredible.
Yeah,
It's
really
just
well
kind
said.
of like a
that.
merry-go-round.
No,
But
I think it was all important. Yeah, it was all important. Wow, really well said.
No, yeah, I completely agree. I think that was incredibly well said. I think community is so important, especially in these days when everybody feels so divided. I think, like how we talked about, I think if people got to talk to each other, I think there would be a lot of bridges that would be gapped. But with that, I think we'll close off this episode. I just want to give a special thank you. I mean,
of course.
I really appreciate you. We all really appreciate you coming on this episode and sharing your story. It means a lot to us.
I appreciate you guys.
Yeah.
If I could add something real quick, just because something popped in my head, and it would be a disservice not to say it. The idea of joy being resistance, I think, is so important. Like being in community, but that doesn't necessarily mean like you have to be in community and you have to be doing this work and it has to be depressing or it has to be like hard or it has to be disheartening. But just like being with community and being joyous, doing the things that we do, dancing, singing, messing around, chistes, like everything, just, messing around with your community, and really building those connections and those relationships and just being joyful, I think is a big F you to the people who continue to try to bring the community down. And yeah, that's all I'll say, that joy joy can be resistance as well. And it doesn't always need to be hard, depressing work. It can be really fun and you can mesh them and incorporate them. And that's something that I've learned from all of my professors. And that's probably like the one thing that continues to fuel me like in this work, that I'm like, it's fun. Like sometimes it's hard, but it can be so fun and so fulfilling. So yeah.
Wow.
That's all that I will add, because that was so important.
No, that was good. That was good. That was
But
important.
thank you guys so much. I appreciate you for
No,
having
thank you.
me.
I think everything you said is very valuable for people to know. I think, like I said, I didn't know that this was a field of study. I'm sure a lot of people don't know that it's a field of study. But I think once you, like you said, once you explore and you get into it, it's like, oh wow, that's me. That's our lives. It's so interesting. So thank you for sharing all that you did. Before we send everybody off, I'm gonna do a shout out to all our patrons. Shout out to Yoel, Eli Quintero, I Am Potato Tots, Stephen Carvajal, Carla Corazon, Altadino Will Rebuild, and Diana Laura. We really appreciate you guys for watching this episode. We hope everybody listening enjoyed. And we'll see you guys next week.
See ya. Bye.